welcome back. And we're shifting things around this morning as we have on set with us representatives of the Forestry and Fisheries Department as we have a conversation about CITES. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Joining us this morning, we have Mercedes Valdez, who's a forester for the Forest Department. In the middle, we have Mauro Gongora, who is a fisheries officer with the Fisheries Department. And on the end, we have Adriany Nicholson, who is the assistant fisheries officer in the Fisheries Department. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is an opportunity for us to educate the wider public on what CITES is. And while we may know of some of the regulations that may be mentioned, we may not know why they're happening, and this is how we tie it all together. First off, I know Mercedes and Adriany, you recently went to study on a course on this specific topic. Tell us a bit about that first.
Actually, yes, we spent 3 months in Spain, and the course was just dedicated on CITES, especially the framework, the administrative aspects, the scientific aspects of the convention. So the benefit that we'll be having on us as a country is that now there's 2 people that are versed with what we are supposed to be doing as a country with the convention. And in addition to that, along with us, there were other 30 participants from other countries like Africa, Australia, Caribbean, and of course Central America. So we saw that we have basically the same issues with CITES, and it also provided us with an opportunity to make a network with all of them, which are specialists in their own fields.
Yeah.
So yes, as Mercedes was mentioning, it was 3 months, 3 intense months. We were in Belize, and it was a collaboration. They said it's the largest class they've had, about 30 to 40 of us from all around. We went there under a project that was funded by U.S. Fish Wildlife, and it was assisted by ATSEMA and WCS.
Okay.
I was
going to say, this obviously, let's just talk about the convention first of all, the origins of it, and what we are responsible for as Belizeans.
Okay, so actually CITES was signed in 1973, but it came into effect in 1975. So Belize was part of it from 1976 under Great Britain. But we signed on to it again as an independent nation in 1981. So what this convention does is that it regulates the international trade of endangered species, so as to not have a negative effect on its population in those countries.
Yeah. And talk to us about the challenges. You said that there are common challenges that you encountered when you were on this specific course. What are the challenges we face here?
Some of the challenges may be, let's say, for example, that misidentification of certain specimens. Like I said, it regulates international trade, and some of them, they mentioned that one of their major challenges are that people are hiding better their specimens, let's say when crossing it through airports, and thus the need to train them more intensively on specimen identification. Yes.
It's as well having involved all the enforcement, not only Fisheries Department and Forestry Department being the focal point management authorities, but having involved the enforcement authorities, the entrance in Belize. So it's not only what we export, but what is coming into the country
as well. Yeah.
Yes.
And I thought of that. I think one of the things that I've never really questioned is how well trained are our personnel at our entry points to be able to detect what is an endangered species and what isn't. I mean, doesn't a piece of wood look like a piece of wood? Or, if a fish is skinned, how do I know exactly what it is?
Yes, and that is one of the great challenges about CITES. So there are certain materials that may look similar to the next one. So before saying that, CITES regulates international trade through 3 appendices. So there is Appendix 1, which are those species that are threatened with extinction and should not be traded, except just like in exceptional cases like research, or let's say, or let's say a zoo exchanging an animal. So those are exceptional cases. Then we have Appendix 2 species, which are those which can be traded, but we would want to regulate its trade so that it doesn't reach those Appendix 1 levels. An example of that in Belize for Forest Department is cycads. Those are ornamental plants. In for Appendix 2, those are mahogany and rosewood. In Appendix 3, we have those species that are not really threatened in its home range, but we would want to protect it. An example of that is cedar. So in order for those to be exported, the person needs to get an export permit and an import permit from that country receiving that material.
Yes. Now, what are the efforts being made to ensure that, because while we have the responsibility to protect what's going out, and I know Mauro and Adriany can share about like fisheries permit and forest permits, forestry permits, but we have some mechanisms in place to protect what goes out. Is it a threat more of what is being exported out of the country or what's coming in?
So for us, Belize, we tend to concentrate on what is going out of Belize, right?
Okay.
The CITES, it's for international trade,
Yes.
but the CITES itself gives framework for Belize to have national legislations, national management of the species, and that's where our portion comes.
Yeah.
For Fisheries Department, conch falls under Appendix 2, which is the one that has a major trade, international trade. And as you know, we have opening seasons, we have closing seasons, quota limits, and throughout Belize, the marine reserves that we have for enforcement within the Belizean waters.
I think that's one of the times, 2 instances that I think that CITES became a part of or regular news coverage was the rosewood issue. And also when there was the threat of the conch being put, I think it was on Appendix 1, where we wouldn't be able to use it as a source here. Thankfully that didn't happen. But it does show why we have to maintain some of the current legislations that we have in place, so there is no overfishing. Talk to us about the practical application of CITES in the everyday work that the Forestry and Fisheries Department do.
For forestry, for the fisheries sector, CITES, we can say that CITES maintains about 2,500 fishermen to have a daily work, to have the bread at the table. So at the end of the day, we all Belizeans do have that, okay, we are dependent of the resources. CITES assist us in having regulated those species for us to still sustain our families and have the benefits.
Well, in the case of the Forest Department, it regulates that international trade of both mahogany, rosewood, and of course cedar. So like what she mentioned, in the end, CITES helps sustain livelihoods of the Belizean people. Currently, the logging industry makes a revenue of $10 million annually and employs up to over 1,500 people. So in the end, CITES is not, well, we can say that many people aren't aware of CITES, but it's an important aspect in our daily lives.
So Mauro, tell us, especially being on the ground and working with fishermen as well, it means that while they may not know all the elements of the convention, there still is a responsibility that we have to educate them. Tell us about that.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of the information regarding CITES in Belize. I want to tell you that two of the main species that we, in the fishery sector, that we deal with that are within Appendix 2 is the queen conch and the hammerhead shark species. There is, in some cases, a situation where people don't understand why is it important for us to follow these rules and regulations, particularly the younger fishers. While CITES mandate is really the international trade of these specimens of wild flora and fauna, and the whole objective is really to ensure that the taking or the harvesting of these species will not cause any detriment to the survival of the species. That's basically what CITES is all about.
Yeah.
We are very concerned about the international trade. And one of the things that we are always working on, and we keep telling our Belizean people, is that illegal fishing, particularly for queen conch,
Yeah.
is a major issue. And while we may not have all the enforcement capacity to ensure that there is minimum illegal fishing, I will tell you that there are instances that, for example, just very recently, we had Fisheries Department arrested a couple of fishers with queen conch.
Yeah.
The season is closed right now.
And it was a substantial amount as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. And so it's important for our fishermen and the general community, fishing community and the wider society on a whole, to respect the fisheries regulations, particularly for queen conch. In recent years, we have seen a decline in production. And that in itself cannot be just attributed to anthropogenic effects, but also has to do with environmental factors. It has to do with climate change and multiple other factors, I would say. That is the very reason why it is important, why fishers and the wider society need to understand that queen conch is a species that is managed internationally. The trade is managed internationally because we want to ensure continuity of the species.
Yeah.
It would be a very bad situation if CITES were to decide to place the queen conch on Appendix 1, which would mean that we would not be able to trade with it.
Yeah. Now, that almost happened a few years back, right? And there was a plea specifically from Belize. I remember having people on the show talking about it.
Yes.
Talking about how we had sustainable practices in Belize. Yeah. Now, that underscores why we have to maintain, even without sufficient enforcement personnel, the very same regulations that we have in place. What do you find to be the challenge in having fishermen buy in? Because you can't have a boat patrolling all the waters in Belize to ensure that people aren't out there extracting the resources out of season. So how do you work to be able to extend the information to them so that they consciously will practice sustainable fishing?
Well, I think one of the best routes to achieve that is certainly through education, public awareness. Our fishing community is very tightly knit, I would say, and especially working through the fishermen cooperatives, we're able to share a lot of information with them. But I am very concerned about the new fishers, those ones, the younger ones, who don't really understand what is the purpose of these regulations. Why do we have them in place? And so it is an opportunity for us to tell the fishing community the regulations are there for a purpose.
Yeah.
All right? And in our case, we have to understand that within the shallow water areas where we fish for quinco, for example, it makes it very easy for fishers to be able to harvest this scum.
Yeah.
And that in itself gives them an opportunity to have a livelihood, but in the end, they have to think about the long-term impacts of their actions at present. And so CITES is there to ensure that we are able to maintain this species in the long term, in the long haul.
And what is the global threat for the queen conch? Because it's not just what's happening here, and that's where the collective responsibility is important.
Well, queen conch has a geographical range within the Caribbean region, and we also fish it in the Central American region. It is, in our view, a species that it is under threat, particularly from illegal fishing, over harvesting in some areas. But I believe that we're making a lot of good efforts. We're working in concert with a number of organizations like the Wake FC, the CRFM, OSPESCA at the regional level. And we're taking measures to ensure that we do the right things. For example, in Belize, we have put together a national plan of action for the management of quinco. And regionally, we also have a regional management plan. And so we're making a lot of strides, very good efforts, and I think that for the long term, I have hope that there's going to be good management of the species.
Now, while CITES specifically talks about the trade, you also want to look at the extraction of the resource, whether from the forest or from the marine waters. How important is collaboration with border countries? Because where we have an actual crossing border point on land, in the waters, if it's a hammerhead fish, it flows freely. Talk to us about how you work with other organizations and other entities to ensure that we're all on the same page.
The CITES Master Course was one of the opportunities we have to collaborate because it was Central American countries and Caribbean countries. So it was one of the opportunities that as Belize we had for that collaboration, communication to start a network, specifically on international trade, discussing the current issues ongoing and how we can move forward. So the course itself gave us an opportunity.
And how are neighboring countries doing in maintaining, especially fishing, sustainable fishing practices?
We all have, well, as a country, we all tend to have our own management practices depending on the country's needs. So it all depends on what needs there are and how we can move towards the management of the species.
Now, you were mentioning before we started this segment that we are moving towards putting in place new legislation to ensure that we are fulfilling our commitments under the convention. Tell me about that.
Okay, so we have since 2003, the government has been doing draft legislations, but hopefully we will be passing that legislation by the end of the year. And what that legislation does is that it will regulate that international trade. It would also give us the powers to, well, the legislation, it has to give us the authority then to do a management authority, which in this case are both Fisheries and Forest Department. Those are the ones which issue those permits. In addition to that, it would give us the authority to have a scientific authority then. This is a group of experts in both terrestrial and marine issues. And they are the ones that advise the management authorities whether or not that export of that species will negatively affect the population in the country. So CITES, it's mostly based on the current population status of that species in that country. Yes.
Now, we spent some time talking about the queen conch, and you did mention the hammerhead, but specifically to forestry, what are some of our threatened areas?
Well, we have that rosewood issue, which was something big in the previous years, and especially with that high demand from the other countries, especially from China. Yes. So after that, the government put a moratorium on rosewood, meaning that nothing could be cut, nothing could be exported until proven that it was legally obtained. So sorry.
It's okay.
Yes. Yes. So what we are presently doing is that we are, well, like I said, we're with the issuance of the permits, and all exports are like with fisheries, the exports come from the cooperatives. Same with the forest department, it comes from the sustainable logging companies. Fisheries department mentioned that they have a quota, and we also have a quota of all that needs to be exported. Once we surpass that quota, then nothing else can be exported. This means that once that quota, anything that passes that quota, that would be considered detrimental to the species in the country.
Now, what I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, is different about forestry. When we think of fishing, you know, the person who's out there who's doing the labor is often the one who gets a direct benefit, even if they work through a cooperative. With forestry, it's usually a larger company, and you just have workers who are executing whatever they've been told. How does it make it more challenging to be able to get the buy-in into protecting species that should be protected, or does it make it more difficult?
Not necessarily. What I've noticed is that we have a lot of support from the logging community, especially with passing of the CITES legislation.
Okay.
Because they know that it will benefit them, like for example with the livelihoods, and they can also continue having that species for the next years to come. Yes.
Why is it important for Belizeans to know and understand that we have signed on to this convention and that we want to be able to fulfill its obligation?
For Belizeans, for all of us Belizeans, it's important since we are part of this. We depend on the resources, and we have that direct and indirect benefit, and because we all need to be part of this convention and part of the commitment, part of what needs to be done in order to sustain the resources for a longer term. So it's not only dependent on fisheries and forestry, as I said, it's all of us in both fisheries and forestry.
Yeah.
We're all on board on this. I just want to mention that under the CITES provisions, there's a need for parties, which are the countries, member countries, to prepare what they call as non-detrimental findings, which is basically a study that would indicate that the species or the specimens that are harvested within that particular country was not done to the detriment of the survival of the species. Now it may sound like a simple matter, but the development and the preparation of a non-detrimental finding is a highly technical scientific piece of work that needs to be done. And that has to be done for fisheries and for forestry. Now,
so how do you find that out? I mean, how do you know the source other than a self-report?
Well, that is the function. That is the function of the scientific authority.
Yeah.
And you asked earlier, what are some of the challenges that we have?
Yeah.
Particularly in the case of Belize. And if you look at at the cadre of professionals in Belize that would be classified as experts in fish stock assessment. We're talking a very small number of people. And so that is a challenge for us because we need to put together these findings and we need to submit those findings to CITES. It's not just about issuing a certificate, a CITES certificate to export a specimen, for example, of queen conch or mahogany, for example, right? In addition to that, recently we have Belize participated in what we call as a legal acquisition finding, which is another layer. The non-detrimental finding was looking at the biological aspects of the specimens. The legal acquisition finding is now looking at the legal aspects, whether the specimen was legally acquired or not. Fortunately, in Belize, the system that we have in place allows us to license our fishers and license our fishing vessels.
Yeah.
And I would venture to say that perhaps 95% of our fishing community is licensed with their vessels.
Yeah.
With forestry, it's, as you mentioned earlier, I believe it's much more simple because the licenses are not issued
Into individuals.
to a huge number of individuals, but to a limited number of investors, right?
And it's
Yeah.
just 6 long-term forest licenses that we have.
Yeah.
So it's just the export is just from those 6 companies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now I was saying that the NDFs is already a provision under CITES, and we try our best to comply with all of these provisions, but it's a challenge, I will tell you.
Yeah.
Now with the coming into force of the legal acquisition findings, there's a grace period. I think it's a year. So by next year, we should be putting together this legal acquisition findings. And it's going to be another challenge, I can tell you. And CITES is doing, remember that CITES is the countries, it's an international agreement of countries, right? And it's legally binding. And so we have a responsibility. And this is what our people need to understand, that it's not just about coming to the Fisheries Department or the Forestry Department for a CITES certificate. There's background work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Information that needs to be generated in order for us to be in a position to issue those certificates. All right? And even when those certificates are issued, there are provisions under CITES that the countries that, the importing country could actually question those certificates. Right.
Yeah.
So
overall, how would you say Belize is doing in being able to uphold the obligations under the convention?
Well, we have been, well, I must admit that in the previous years we have been kind of being behind. But like I said, this year we'll be passing our CITES legislation. And there we would have like more powers, more the authority to implement our obligations under CITES. Yes.
All right. And ladies, what's your intention, since you've done this master's course on the convention? What's your intention now that you're back, in other than educating Belize?
So currently there are activities with the passing of the legislation. There comes the management authority, comes the formation of the scientific authority. So we are being involved. We're actively in those activities and continuing with the implementation, what Belize needs to do. Under the master's program, we also have a thesis to work on, a research project. And for the rest of the year, we need to concentrate on finalizing.
Yeah. All right. Anything else you'd like to share with us this morning that you think will help Belizeans to understand the importance of the convention?
Well, I would just like to say that CITES is not there to protect or overprotect a species. It is there to regulate that international trade so that we could continue trading that species in
Yeah.
future years. Yes.
So yes, it's not about saying no, we can't continue with the trade of the species, but we will continue in the longer term if we all collaborate together.
It's sustainability.
Yes.
That's what it is all about. And I think just as a final note, I'd like to, for the general public to know that under CITES, there's a CITES decision. I can't remember exactly the reference number, but in the past, people used to come to Fisheries for a CITES certificate for a queen conch shell. But with that CITES decision, it is now possible for people, a person,
Yeah.
to take as much as 3 shells without a CITES certificate. So whether it's a small queen conch shell or a big conch shell, that's one. So you can take as much as 3 without the CITES
person.
certificate per person, per trip. All right?
Well, that's good information for people to know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming in and talking a bit about how we are doing when it comes to assisting in the protection of endangered species. You know, I know, as I mentioned before, sometimes it hits closer to home when we see the larger issues, but the work continues on a daily basis. So thank you for coming in and telling us.
Thank you too.
We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll have the winner of KTV The Remix Season 2, so stay tuned.